The woman's screams echoed across the frozen expanse of the lake, swallowed by the howling wind that swept across the Kansas plains in the brutal winter of 1878. Clara Zimmerman had made a terrible mistake venturing out alone, but desperation had driven her from the settlement when her husband never returned from his hunting trip 3 days prior, and the labor pains had started with such sudden violence that she had no choice but to flee the judgment and whispers of the townspeople who already considered her an outsider. The ice beneath her cracked ominously as another contraction tore through her body, and she collapsed onto her knees, her heavy woolen skirt spreading around her like dark wings against the white surface. She had thought she could make it to the old trapper's cabin on the far shore, the one her husband had mentioned in passing, but the baby was coming now, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The cold bit through her clothes with vicious teeth, and she knew with terrible certainty that she might die out here, that her child might never draw breath in this world. Blood stained the ice beneath her, as she bore down with a primal scream that seemed to crack the very sky above. The wind answered with its own howl, and snow began to fall in thick, heavy flakes that obscured everything beyond a few feet. Her fingers were numb as she worked to free herself from the layers of clothing, and when the baby finally slipped from her body into her trembling hands, the silence that followed was more terrifying than any sound. She pulled the infant close to her chest, wrapping him in the folds of her coat, rubbing his tiny back with desperate urgency. The first cry was weak, barely more than a mewl, but it was life, and Clara sobbed with relief even as her own strength began to fade. The afterbirth came in a rush of warmth that steamed in the frigid air, and she knew she needed to move, needed to find shelter, but her legs would not obey her commands. The cold was stealing her thoughts now, making everything soft and distant. She curled around her newborn son, trying to shield him with her body, and began to pray in a voice that was nothing more than a whisper carried away by the wind. Blake Morrison had been tracking the elk for 2 days, following its trail through the snow-covered foothills and down toward the frozen lake that stretched like a mirror between the ridges. He was a cowboy by trade, though winter had driven him from the ranch work to hunting and trapping to make ends meet. At 26 years old, he had seen enough of life to know that survival in this country meant staying alert, staying moving, and never trusting the weather. The storm had come up suddenly, as they often did in Kansas during the winter months, and Blake had been preparing to make camp in a stand of cottonwoods when he heard something that made his blood run cold. It was a sound that did not belong in the wilderness, a human cry that was abruptly cut short by the wind. He turned his horse, a sturdy bay mare named Copper, toward the lake and urged her forward through the deepening snow. The visibility was terrible, and he almost missed the dark shape on the ice entirely. It was only Copper's nervous whinny that made him look closer, and when he saw the woman lying there with something bundled against her chest, his heart began to hammer in his chest. He dismounted quickly, leaving Copper on the shore, and ran out onto the ice despite the danger. The woman was unconscious, her lips blue with cold, but the bundle in her arms was moving. Blake knelt beside her and carefully pulled back the fabric to reveal a newborn baby, still connected to its mother by a pulsing cord. The infant's cries were growing weaker, and Blake knew they had minutes, not hours. He pulled off his heavy coat and wrapped it around both mother and child, then drew his knife and cut the umbilical cord with hands that shook only slightly. He tied it off with a leather thong from his belt, working quickly and efficiently despite having never done such a thing before. His sister had birthed 3 children on their family farm back in Missouri, and he had been present for one of them, enough to know the basics. Getting them off the ice was the next challenge. The woman was unconscious and could not walk, and the baby needed warmth immediately. Blake scooped the woman into his arms, careful to keep the infant secure against her chest, and began the treacherous journey back to shore. The ice groaned beneath their combined weight, and once he felt it shift beneath his boots, but he did not stop moving until he reached solid ground. Copper stood waiting, her eyes rolling with nervous energy, and Blake quickly secured his burden across the saddle before mounting behind them. The trapper's cabin was less than a mile north, and he pushed Copper as hard as he dared through the storm, one arm wrapped around the unconscious woman to keep her from falling. The cabin was small and dark when they arrived, but it was shelter, and that was all that mattered. Blake kicked the door open and carried the woman inside, laying her on the single bed in the corner. The baby was still crying weakly, and Blake worked to build a fire in the stone hearth, coaxing flames from kindling with hands that felt clumsy and thick. Once the fire was crackling, he turned his attention back to his patients. The woman needed to be warmed gradually, he knew, or the shock could kill her. He removed her wet outer clothing and wrapped her in the dry blankets he found in a trunk at the foot of the bed, then carefully took the baby and examined him by the firelight. The infant was small but appeared healthy, his limbs moving with surprising strength as he wailed his displeasure at the world. Blake had no experience with babies, but instinct told him the child needed to be cleaned and kept warm. He heated water in a pot over the fire and used a clean cloth to gently wash the blood and birthing fluids from the tiny body, marveling at how perfect and fragile the little boy was. When the baby was clean and wrapped in the softest blanket Blake could find, he placed him back in his mother's arms, hoping the contact would help them both. Then he set about making the cabin truly habitable, bringing in firewood from the covered pile outside, checking the supplies left by the trapper who owned this place, and melting snow for drinking water. It was well past dark when the woman finally stirred. Blake was sitting in the chair beside the bed, whittling a piece of wood to keep his hands busy, when he heard her gasp. He was on his feet instantly, moving to her side, her eyes opened slowly, confusion and fear evident in their green depths. She clutched the baby to her chest protectively, and Blake held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "Easy now," he said softly. "You are safe. I found you on the lake and brought you here. The cabin belongs to an old trapper named Gus, but he is down in Dodge City for the winter. We can stay here until the storm passes." She stared at him for a long moment, and he could see her mind working, trying to piece together what had happened. When she finally spoke, her voice was hoarse and barely audible. "My baby." "He is fine," Blake assured her, nodding toward the bundle in her arms. "Healthy and strong from what I can tell. You both came real close to freezing to death out there, though. What were you doing on the ice?" Tears began to stream down her face and she shook her head. "I was trying to reach this cabin. My husband went hunting and never came back. The baby started coming and I could not stay in the settlement. I thought I had more time." Blake felt a surge of anger at the husband who had abandoned his pregnant wife, but he kept his voice calm. "What is your name?" "Clara Zimmerman," she whispered. "And you are Blake Morrison." "I am a ranch hand from the Double M spread about 20 miles south of Dodge City. I have been out hunting when the storm caught me." He paused, then added, "Your boy needs to eat. Can you feed him?" Clara looked down at the baby and fresh tears spilled over. "I do not know if I can. I am so cold and I feel so weak." "You need to try," Blake said firmly. "I will turn around and give you privacy, but he needs the nourishment and it will help your body recover too." He moved to the fire and busied himself with preparing food while Clara attempted to nurse her son. He could hear her soft murmurs of encouragement and the baby's fretful cries, and then finally blessed silence that told him the infant had latched on. The storm raged outside for 3 full days. During that time, Blake cared for Clara and her newborn son with a tenderness that surprised him. He cooked simple meals from the supplies in the cabin, kept the fire burning hot, and changed the baby's cloths when needed, fashioning makeshift diapers from an old sheet he tore into squares. Clara regained her strength slowly, and as she did, Blake learned her story. She had come west from Ohio with her husband, Robert, seeking a fresh start after his business failed back east. They had settled near a small community about 30 miles from the cabin, trying to make a living farming the hard Kansas soil. Robert had been a dreamer, full of big plans that never seemed to materialize, and Clara had done her best to make their rough homestead into a home. When she had discovered she was pregnant, Robert had seemed excited at first, but as the months passed and the reality of another mouth to feed set in, he had grown distant and irritable. He had gone out hunting supposedly to stock their larder for winter, but Clara suspected he had simply wanted to escape the responsibility waiting for him. Blake listened without judgment, his own heart aching for this woman who had been through so much. He told her about his own life, growing up on a farm in Missouri with 3 sisters and 2 brothers, coming west after his father died to seek his fortune. The ranch work was hard but honest, and he had been saving money with the vague idea of buying his own land someday. On the 4th day, the storm broke, and the sun emerged in a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Blake ventured outside to check on Copper and assess their situation. The world was transformed into a landscape of white, with drifts piled high against the cabin walls, and the trees bowed under the weight of snow. When he returned inside, Clara was sitting up in bed with the baby at her breast, and there was color in her cheeks for the first time since he had found her. She looked up at him and smiled tentatively. "The storm is over." "It is," he confirmed. "But travel will be difficult for a few days yet, until the snow settles. We should stay here where it is safe and warm." Clara nodded, then said quietly, "I do not know how to thank you, Blake. You saved both our lives. If you had not found us when you did—" "Do not think about that," he interrupted gently. "You are both alive, and that is what matters. Have you thought about what you will name him?" She looked down at her son, her expression softening. "Thomas," she said, "after my father, Thomas Robert Zimmerman." The name twisted something in Blake's gut, the reminder that this child had a father somewhere, even if he was not here. But he simply nodded and said, "It is a good, strong name." Over the following days, as Clara continued to recover, and baby Thomas grew more alert and healthy, Blake found himself watching them with a feeling he could not quite name. There was something about the way Clara held her son, the fierce protective love in her eyes, that made his chest tighten with emotion. And when she smiled at him over some small thing, her whole face lighting up, he felt like he had been punched in the stomach. He tried to tell himself it was just the circumstances, the intimacy forced by their situation, but he knew it was more than that. Clara was beautiful, yes, with her dark hair and green eyes and the delicate line of her jaw, but it was more than beauty. She had a strength in her, a resilience that had allowed her to survive what should have killed her. She was smart and funny, with a dry wit that emerged as she felt more comfortable around him, and she had a way of looking at him that made him feel seen in a way he never had before. But she was married, and that was a line Blake would not cross. He kept his growing feelings locked away, treating her with the same careful courtesy he had from the beginning, even as his heart betrayed him every time she laughed. On the 8th day in the cabin, Clara asked Blake to tell her honestly what he thought had happened to Robert. They were sitting by the fire after supper, Thomas asleep in a makeshift cradle Blake had fashioned from a wooden crate and some blankets. Blake was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. This country is hard on men who are not prepared for it. The winter is brutal, and there are dangers everywhere. Wolves, cold, getting lost in a storm. It is possible he met with an accident. But you do not think so, Clara said, reading the hesitation in his voice. Blake met her eyes. I think a man who truly wanted to come home would have found a way. I think you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that he might not be coming back, whether by choice or by fate. Clara nodded slowly, and he saw tears glisten in her eyes, though she did not let them fall. I have been thinking the same thing, she admitted. And the truth is, Blake, even if he does come back, I do not know if I can forgive him for leaving me when I needed him most. Does that make me a terrible person? No, Blake said firmly. It makes you human. You deserve better than a man who would abandon you and his child. She looked at him for a long moment, and something passed between them, a recognition that hung in the air like smoke. Then Thomas made a small sound in his sleep, breaking the spell, and Clara rose to check on him. That night, as Blake lay in his bedroll on the floor near the fire, he stared at the ceiling and tried to figure out what he was going to do. He could not keep Clara and Thomas in this cabin forever. Eventually, they would need to return to civilization, to figure out what came next. But the thought of leaving them, of going back to his solitary life as a ranch hand, felt unbearable. The next morning, Clara announced that she felt strong enough to travel if they took it slow. Blake had been expecting this, but it still hit him like a physical blow. He agreed, though, because it was the right thing to do, and began preparing for the journey. They would go to Dodge City, he decided. It was the nearest settlement of any size, and Clara would be able to find help there, whether from the church or from other women in the community. He could see her settled safely before he continued on his way. The journey took 2 full days because they had to move slowly for Clara's sake. Blake fashioned a sling so she could carry Thomas against her chest, keeping him warm and freeing her hands to hold onto Copper's saddle. Blake walked alongside, leading the horse and helping Clara whenever the terrain got difficult. They spent the night in a shallow cave Blake knew about, building a fire at the entrance to keep them warm and ward off any predators. As they sat together eating jerky and hardtack, Clara said suddenly, "What will you do after you leave us in Dodge City?" Blake poked at the fire with a stick. "Go back to the ranch, I suppose, if they still have work for me. If not, I will find something else." "Do you ever think about settling down?" Clara asked. "Starting a family of your own?" "Sometimes," he admitted. "But I have never met a woman who made me want to give up the freedom of the cowboy life, until—" He stopped abruptly, realizing he had said too much. Clara was looking at him with wide eyes, her lips slightly parted. "Until," she prompted softly. Blake shook his head. "It does not matter. You are married, Clara, and I am just the man who happened to find you. Once we get to Dodge City, we will both go our separate ways, and this will just be a story we tell someday." "And if I do not want that," Clara said, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. Blake's heart stopped. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the same longing in her eyes that he felt in his own chest. "Clara, I know it is wrong," she said quickly. "I know I am married, at least in the eyes of the law, but Robert left me to die, Blake. He left his child to die, and you saved us. You cared for us when you could have just ridden past. You have shown me more kindness in these past days than Robert did in our entire marriage. I do not want to say goodbye to you in Dodge City and never see you again." "What are you saying?" Blake asked, though he thought he hoped he knew. "I am saying that I have feelings for you," Clara said, her cheeks flushing red. "I know it is too soon. I know the circumstances are all wrong, but I cannot help it." When I look at you, I see the man I wish Thomas's father could have been. I see the man I wish I had married instead of Robert, and I think you might feel the same way about me." Blake was silent for a long moment, warring with himself. Every rule he had ever learned about honor and decency told him to shut this conversation down, to remind her of her vows, to keep his distance. But his heart was screaming at him to reach across the fire and take her hand, to tell her that he felt exactly the same way. "I do," he finally said, his voice rough. "I care about you, Clara, more than I should, but we cannot act on these feelings, not while you are still married. It would not be right." "Then help me find out what happened to Robert," Clara said urgently. "Help me learn the truth so I can know if I am a wife or a widow. Please, Blake, I need to know." He looked at her, at the desperation and hope in her eyes, and knew he could not refuse her. "All right," he said quietly. "We will find out what happened to your husband. But Clara, you need to understand that whatever we discover, it might not be the answer you want." "I know," she said, "but not knowing is worse than any truth could be." They reached Dodge City the following afternoon, riding down Front Street past the saloons and shops that made up the heart of the rough cattle town. Blake took them directly to the boarding house run by Mrs. Patterson, a widow he knew to be respectable and kind. He explained that Clara was a new widow herself, though he hated the lie, and that she needed a safe place to stay with her newborn son. Mrs. Patterson took one look at Clara's exhausted face and Thomas's tiny form, and ushered them inside without further questions. Blake paid for 2 weeks' room and board with most of the money he had been saving, telling himself it was the right thing to do, even as his stomach twisted at the thought of having nothing left. Once Clara was settled in a clean room with a comfortable bed, and promised that Mrs. Patterson would help her with anything she needed, Blake prepared to leave. He stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands, and tried to find the words to say goodbye. "I will start asking around about Robert," he said. "The sheriff might know something, or some of the trappers and hunters who come through. I will get you answers, Clara, I promise." "Thank you," she whispered, and there were tears on her cheeks. "For everything, Blake. I owe you my life." "You do not owe me anything," he said firmly. "You just focus on taking care of yourself and that boy. I will be back as soon as I learn something." He left before he could do something foolish like kiss her, and walked out into the cold afternoon with his heart feeling like it had been ripped from his chest. The investigation into Robert Zimmerman's fate took Blake 3 weeks of hard riding and harder questions. He spoke to the sheriff in Dodge City, who had no record of anyone matching Robert's description. He rode out to the settlement, where Clara and Robert had been living, and talked to their neighbors, who confirmed that Robert had left in early December saying he was going hunting and had never returned. Several of the men from the settlement had conducted a brief search when Robert did not come back after a week, but the storms had made it impossible to continue, and most had assumed he had gotten lost and frozen to death. No one seemed particularly broken up about it, and Blake got the distinct impression that Robert Zimmerman had not been well liked. Blake then spent days riding through the wilderness, checking the hunting camps and trappers' cabins in the region, showing everyone he met a description of Robert. It was at a small trading post 2 days' ride from where Clara and Robert had lived that he finally got his answer. The trader, a grizzled man named Pete who had been working this territory for 30 years, recognized the description immediately. "Sure, I know that fellow," Pete said. "Came through here about 2 months back, middle of December. Sold me a good rifle and some traps, said he was heading down to Texas to try his luck there. Had a real nervous way about him, like he was running from something." "Did he mention a wife?" Blake asked, his jaw tight. "Nope," Pete said. "Told me he was a bachelor looking for adventure. Bought supplies for a long journey south and headed out. Have not seen him since. Blake thanked the trader and rode back to Dodge City with a mixture of fury and relief burning in his chest. Robert Zimmerman had not died in a hunting accident. He had deliberately abandoned his pregnant wife, sold his possessions, and fled to Texas to start a new life. It was the clearest case of desertion Blake could imagine, and under frontier law, it meant Clara was free. When he walked into Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, Clara was sitting in the parlor with Thomas in her arms, rocking him gently. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, and the hope in her eyes nearly broke him. "I found out what happened," he said without preamble. "Can we speak privately?" Clara nodded and rose carefully, following him outside onto the front porch. The January afternoon was cold but clear, and Blake could see his breath misting in the air as he spoke. "Robert is alive," he said, watching Clara's face carefully. "He made it to a trading post 2 days east of here, sold his rifle and supplies, and told the trader he was a bachelor heading to Texas to seek his fortune. That was 2 months ago, right around the time he would have left on his hunting trip." Clara's face went pale, and then red with anger. "He left me," she said flatly. "He knew I was pregnant, knew the baby was coming soon, and he just left me to fend for myself." "Yes," Blake confirmed. "Under the law, that is desertion. You are entitled to dissolve the marriage and have no legal obligation to him anymore. I can help you file the papers with the territorial court." Clara was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the street. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "I should be devastated. I should be heartbroken. But all I feel is relief that I do not have to pretend to mourn him anymore." "Does that make me cold?" "No," Blake said, moving closer to her. "It makes you honest. He did not deserve you, Clara. He never did." She turned to look at him, and there were tears in her eyes but also something fierce and determined. "What happens now?" "Now you file for dissolution of marriage," Blake said. "It will take a few months for the court to process it, but given the circumstances, it should go through without problems. And then—" "And then," she prompted. Blake took a deep breath, gathering his courage. "And then, if you will have me, I would like to court you properly. I would like to get to know you better, without the shadow of your marriage hanging over us. I would like to see if what we feel for each other now is real, or just gratitude and circumstance." Clara's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "I would like that too," she said. "But Blake, you should know something. What I feel for you is not gratitude. It is not circumstance. I am falling in love with you, and I think I have been since the moment I woke up in that cabin and saw you sitting there whittling wood like you had all the time in the world." Blake's heart soared. He wanted to kiss her right there on the porch, wanted to pull her into his arms and never let go, but he held himself back. "Then we will do this right," he said. "I will court you proper, Clara Zimmerman, and when your marriage is dissolved and you are free, I will ask you to marry me. If you will have a simple cowboy with no prospects but a lot of love in his heart." "I will have you," Clara said softly. "Whenever you ask, the answer will be yes." The next 5 months were the happiest and most frustrating of Blake's life. He found work at a ranch just outside Dodge City, so he could stay close to Clara and Thomas. He visited them every Sunday at the boarding house, always with Mrs. Patterson or another lady present to maintain propriety, and he courted Clara with all the patience and dedication he possessed. He brought her wildflowers when they bloomed in spring, and fresh vegetables from the ranch garden. He held Thomas and rocked him while Clara rested, marveling at how much the baby grew each week. He took Clara for walks through town, always properly chaperoned, and they talked about everything under the sun. Blake learned that Clara loved poetry and could recite long passages from memory. He learned that she had always wanted to learn to ride a horse, but Robert had never taught her. He learned that she had a gift for sewing and had been making beautiful quilts that she sold to help pay for her room and board. Clara learned that Blake could play the harmonica and had a surprisingly good singing voice. She learned that he had once dreamed of being a schoolteacher, but had given it up when his father died, and he needed to help support his family. She learned that he was patient and kind, with a gentle strength that made her feel safe in a way she never had before. They fell deeper in love with every passing week, and by the time summer arrived and the dissolution papers came through from the territorial court, they were both certain that this was meant to be. Blake proposed on a warm June evening, taking Clara out to a meadow just beyond town where the wildflowers grew thick, and the sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and gold. He had Thomas in a sling across his chest, the baby gurgling happily, and Clara was laughing at something he had said when he suddenly dropped to one knee. "Clara Zimmerman," he said, pulling a simple gold band from his pocket. "You are the strongest, kindest, most beautiful woman I have ever known. You have made me want to be a better man, and I cannot imagine spending my life with anyone but you. Will you marry me? Will you let me be a father to Thomas and a husband to you for the rest of our days?" Clara was crying, but they were happy tears. "Yes," she said, pulling him to his feet. "Yes, Blake Morrison, I will marry you. Today, tomorrow, whenever you want." They kissed for the first time there in the meadow, with Thomas between them and the sun setting behind the horizon. It was sweet and tender and full of promise, and when they finally pulled apart, they were both smiling like fools. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in the small church in Dodge City. Clara wore a simple white dress she had sewn herself, with wildflowers in her hair, and Blake wore his best suit, borrowed from the ranch foreman. Thomas was there too, of course, held by Mrs. Patterson during the ceremony and gurgling his approval when Blake kissed his bride. It was a small gathering, just a few friends they had made in town and some of Blake's fellow ranch hands, but it was perfect. After the ceremony, there was a modest celebration at the boarding house, with cake and lemonade and dancing to music from a fiddle player Mrs. Patterson had hired. As Blake and Clara took their first dance as husband and wife, swaying gently to a simple waltz, Clara rested her head on Blake's shoulder and whispered, "Thank you for finding me on that frozen lake. Thank you for saving my life." "Thank you for giving me a reason to live it," Blake whispered back. "You and Thomas are everything to me, Clara. I promise I will spend every day making you happy." "You already do," she said, lifting her head to smile at him. "You already do." They moved into a small house Blake had been renting on the outskirts of Dodge City, and for the first few months, life was simple and sweet. Blake worked at the ranch during the day while Clara cared for Thomas and took in sewing work to help with the household expenses. In the evenings, they would sit together on the porch, watching the sun set over the Kansas plains and talk about their dreams for the future. Blake wanted to buy land and start his own ranch someday, something small but prosperous. Clara wanted to keep sewing and maybe open a little shop where she could sell her quilts and other goods. They both wanted more children, brothers and sisters for Thomas to grow up with. Thomas thrived under their care, growing into a chubby, happy baby who smiled easily and laughed often. Blake loved him as if he were his own blood, and Thomas responded to him with open affection, reaching for Blake whenever he walked into the room and crying when he left. One evening in late September, as they were getting ready for bed, Clara turned to Blake with a shy smile. "I have something to tell you," she said. "I am pregnant again. We are going to have another baby sometime in the spring." Blake's whoop of joy startled Thomas, who had been sleeping in his cradle, and the baby began to cry. But Blake could not stop smiling as he gathered both Clara and Thomas into his arms. "Are you certain?" he asked, though he could see the answer in her glowing face. I am certain, Clara confirmed. Are you happy? Happy does not even begin to cover it, Blake said, kissing her soundly. You have given me everything I ever wanted, Clara. A family, a home, a purpose. I love you so much. I love you too, Clara said, her eyes shining with tears. And I am so grateful that you found me that day on the ice. It was the worst day of my life, but it led me to you, and I cannot regret it. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and in April of 1880, Clara gave birth to a healthy baby boy they named James Blake Morrison. The birth took place in their little house with the help of a midwife and Mrs. Patterson, and Blake was allowed to be present this time, holding Clara's hand and murmuring encouragement as she labored. When James finally arrived, red-faced and squalling, Blake cut the cord himself and placed the baby in Clara's arms. She looked exhausted but radiant, and when she smiled up at him, Blake felt his heart might burst from happiness. Thomas, now almost 2 years old, was fascinated by his baby brother. He would sit beside Clara while she nursed James, patting the baby's head gently and singing nonsense songs he made up himself. Blake had officially adopted Thomas after the wedding, and the boy knew no father but him. It filled Blake with fierce pride to see his 2 sons together, to know that he was building the family he had always dreamed of. As the years passed, Blake worked hard and saved every penny he could. By 1883, he had enough money saved to buy a parcel of land 20 miles west of Dodge City. Good grazing land with a creek running through it and a stand of cottonwoods for shade. He and Clara built a house there, nothing fancy but solid and comfortable, with 3 bedrooms and a wide front porch. They started small, with just a dozen head of cattle and some chickens, but Blake was a good rancher and the land was fertile. Within 2 years, they had tripled their herd and were turning a modest profit. Clara opened her sewing business out of their home, and word of her beautiful quilts and fine stitching spread throughout the county. In 1884, Clara gave birth to twin girls, Grace and Lily, and the house that had seemed so spacious suddenly felt cozy and warm with all the children's laughter and noise. Thomas was 6 now and a big help on the ranch, following Blake everywhere and learning to ride and rope. James was 4 and already showing signs of being a natural with animals, gentling the horses with patience beyond his years. The girls were identical, with Clara's dark hair and Blake's blue eyes, and they kept both parents on their toes with their mischievous antics. Blake loved them fiercely, these daughters who looked so much like their mother, and he was already dreading the day when young men would come calling. Life was not always easy. There were droughts that made the grazing scarce and harsh winters that took their toll on the herd. There were times when money was tight and they worried about making ends meet. But through it all, Blake and Clara faced every challenge together, their love growing deeper and stronger with each passing year. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1889, Blake took Clara back to the meadow where he had proposed. The children were staying with Mrs. Patterson in town for the night, giving them rare time alone together. They spread a blanket under the stars and lay together, hand in hand, looking up at the vast Kansas sky. "You ever think about that day on the lake?" Blake asked softly. "The day I found you, sometimes," Clara admitted. "It seems like a lifetime ago now, like it happened to different people." "In some ways it did," Blake said. "You were running from a man who did not deserve you, and I was just drifting through life without purpose. And then we found each other, and everything changed." Clara turned to look at him, her face soft in the moonlight. "You gave me everything I never knew I needed, Blake. A real partnership, a true family, a love that makes me feel cherished every single day. I am so grateful for you." "I am the grateful one," Blake insisted, pulling her close. "You made me a husband and a father. You gave my life meaning. Everything good in my world comes from you, Clara." They made love there under the stars, tenderly and sweetly, reaffirming the vows they had spoken a decade ago. And when they finally returned home the next day to their noisy, chaotic, beautiful family, they both knew that they had built something real and lasting. In 1891, Clara gave birth to their last child, another son they named Samuel. At 39, Blake found himself the father of 6 children, and he could not have been prouder. The ranch was prospering now, and they had hired 2 hands to help with the work. Clara's sewing business was thriving, and she had even begun teaching some of the younger women in the area her techniques. Thomas was 13 and already nearly as tall as Blake, a serious young man who worked hard and dreamed of expanding the ranch someday. James was 11 and had a gift with horses that was drawing attention from breeders throughout the county. The twins were 7 and in school, learning to read and write and bringing home papers covered in careful letters for their parents to admire. And baby Samuel was a joy, a happy child who smiled at everyone and everything. On winter evenings, they would all gather in the parlor, the children doing schoolwork or playing quiet games while Blake read aloud from books he ordered from Kansas City. Clara would sew by lamplight, her needle flashing, occasionally looking up to smile at the scene before her. These were the moments Blake treasured most, when his whole family was together and safe and happy. He would look around at the faces of his wife and children, at the home they had built together, and feel overwhelming gratitude for the twist of fate that had led him to that frozen lake so many years ago. One evening, when Samuel was 2 years old and the whole family was gathered for Sunday dinner, Thomas stood up and cleared his throat nervously. At 15, he was a young man now, with Blake's height and Clara's dark hair, and he looked between his parents with an expression that was half excited, half terrified. "I want to say something," he announced. The table fell quiet and Thomas took a deep breath. "I know that Blake is not my blood father. You have never hidden that from me, and I am grateful for your honesty. But I want you to know that I have never thought of him as anything but my true father. He is the one who raised me, who taught me everything I know, who has loved me every day of my life." Blake felt his throat tighten with emotion, and he saw Clara reaching for a handkerchief to dab at her eyes. "I do not remember that first father, the one who left before I was born," Thomas continued. "And I do not want to. As far as I am concerned, I have only ever had one father, and that is you, Blake. You found my mother on that frozen lake and saved both our lives. You could have left us in Dodge City and ridden away, but you stayed. You chose us, even when you did not have to. And I want to thank you for that, for giving me the best childhood a boy could ask for." Blake was out of his chair before Thomas finished speaking, pulling his oldest son into a fierce embrace. "You are my son in every way that matters," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I have never for 1 second regretted choosing you and your mother. You are one of the best things that ever happened to me, Thomas, and I am so proud of the man you are becoming." The family gathered around them, Clara joining the embrace with tears streaming down her face, and the younger children piling on with laughter and affection. It was a perfect moment, one that crystallized everything Blake and Clara had built together. As the years continued to pass, the Morrison family became a fixture in the community around Dodge City. Blake served on the town council and helped mediate disputes between ranchers. Clara's quilts were famous throughout Kansas, and she trained several apprentices in her craft. Their children grew strong and capable, each finding their own path in the world. Thomas eventually married a schoolteacher named Sarah and started his own ranch adjacent to Blake and Clara's land. James became a renowned horse trainer, traveling throughout the West to work with difficult animals. The twins, Grace and Lily, both became teachers like their sister-in-law, opening a small school for the children of ranch families in the area. Samuel, the youngest, showed an interest in medicine and was eventually sent to Kansas City to study with a doctor there. Through it all, Blake and Clara remained each other's anchor and shelter. They still took walks together in the evenings when the work was done, still sat on the porch and watched the sun set over their land. They had weathered storms both literal and metaphorical, had faced challenges and celebrated triumphs, and their love had only deepened with time. On their 30th wedding anniversary in 1909, the whole family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. Thomas and Sarah brought their 3 children. James came with his new wife. The twins arrived with their husbands and babies, and Samuel returned from Kansas City with stories of his medical training. As Blake looked around at the crowd of people who had gathered to celebrate their love, he was overwhelmed by how much his life had changed since that cold winter day in 1878, when he found a woman giving birth alone on a frozen lake. He had been a solitary cowboy then, with no ties and no purpose beyond his next paycheck. Now he was surrounded by family, by love, by the legacy he and Clara had built together. That evening, after the guests had gone home and the house was quiet, Blake and Clara sat together on their porch swing, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Clara rested her head on Blake's shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "We have had a good life, have we not?" Clara said softly. "The best life," Blake agreed. "Better than anything I could have imagined." "Sometimes I still think about that day on the ice," Clara admitted. "How terrified I was, how certain I was going to die. And then you appeared, like an answer to a prayer I had not even finished saying. You were my miracle, Blake." "You were mine too," Blake said, kissing the top of her head. "You gave me everything I had been searching for without even knowing it. A home, a family, a reason to wake up every morning with joy in my heart." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the ranch and feeling the warmth of each other's presence. Finally, Clara said, "If I could go back and change anything about my life, I would not. Every hardship, every struggle, every moment of fear and pain led me to you, and that makes it all worthwhile." "I feel the same way," Blake said. "I would not trade a single day of our life together, not for all the gold in California." As they sat there together under the stars, Blake thought about the young cowboy he had been and the old man he was becoming. He thought about Clara, who had survived the impossible and emerged stronger for it. He thought about their children and grandchildren, about the family they had created from love and determination and sheer stubborn hope. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that finding Clara on that frozen lake had been the best moment of his entire life. It had been the beginning of everything that mattered, the foundation upon which he had built his entire world. Years later, when Blake and Clara were both old and gray, they would still tell the story to their grandchildren. They would talk about the frozen lake, and the desperate young woman, and the cowboy who happened to ride by at exactly the right moment. They would talk about the tiny cabin where they fell in love, about the long courtship and the beautiful wedding, about the ranch and the children and all the adventures in between. And the grandchildren would listen with wide eyes, enchanted by the romance and drama of it all. They would ask questions about what it felt like, about whether Blake had known right away that Clara was special, about how scary it must have been to give birth on the ice. Blake and Clara would answer patiently, sometimes disagreeing about the details but always agreeing on the most important parts. They had found each other when they needed each other most. They had chosen love over fear, hope over despair. And they had built a life together that was worth every struggle, every sacrifice, every moment of doubt. On a warm summer evening in 1915, Blake and Clara sat together on their porch for the last time. Blake was 73 now, and his heart had been giving him trouble for months. Clara was 67, still beautiful despite the lines on her face and the silver in her hair. They held hands as they watched the sunset, painting the Kansas sky in shades of gold and crimson. "It has been a beautiful life," Clara said softly, as if she could read Blake's thoughts. "The most beautiful," Blake agreed. "I would not change a single moment." "Even the hard parts?" Clara asked. "Especially the hard parts," Blake said. "They made us who we are, they made us stronger, and they made the good parts that much sweeter." Clara squeezed his hand. "I love you, Blake Morrison. I have loved you since the moment I woke up in that cabin and saw you sitting there, keeping watch over me and my baby. You have been my partner, my protector, my best friend, and the love of my life. Thank you for choosing us." "Thank you for letting me," Blake said, his voice thick with emotion. "You and Thomas saved me just as much as I saved you that day. You gave my life purpose and meaning. You made me whole." They sat together as the stars emerged, as the night creatures began their songs, as the world turned on its axis. And when Blake finally closed his eyes for the last time, it was with Clara's hand in his and the memory of their life together warming his heart. Clara lived another 5 years after Blake passed, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She never remarried, telling anyone who asked that she had already had the love of a lifetime and did not need another. She spent her final years quilting and telling stories, keeping Blake's memory alive for the younger generations who had never known him. When she finally joined him in 1920, she was buried beside him in the family plot on the ranch they had built together. The headstone was simple, just their names and dates and a single line that Thomas had chosen. "She gave birth alone on a frozen lake. He found her and brought them home. Together they built a love that lasted forever." And indeed, their love did last forever, living on in the children they had raised, the grandchildren they had cherished, and the great-grandchildren who would carry their legacy into the future. The story of Blake and Clara Morrison became part of the family mythology, passed down through generations as an example of what true love could accomplish against impossible odds. The ranch they had started continued to thrive, eventually growing into one of the most successful operations in Kansas. The sewing techniques Clara had taught were still practiced by her descendants, creating beautiful quilts that were treasured as family heirlooms. The values Blake and Clara had instilled in their children, hard work, honesty, compassion, and unwavering dedication to family, were passed down like precious jewels. And sometimes, on cold winter nights when the wind howled across the Kansas plains, the descendants of Blake and Clara Morrison would gather around fires and tell the story of their remarkable ancestors. They would talk about the young woman who survived the impossible, the cowboy who saved her life, and the extraordinary love that grew from that desperate moment on a frozen lake. It was a love story for the ages, a testament to the power of choosing kindness over convenience, love over fear, and hope over despair. It was the story of two people who found each other at their lowest moments and lifted each other up to heights neither could have reached alone. And it all began on a frozen lake in Kansas in 1878, with a woman's desperate cry carried on the winter wind, and a cowboy who chose to investigate instead of riding away. That single choice, that moment of compassion and courage, had changed everything. It had created a family, built a legacy, and proven that even in the harshest circumstances, love could not only survive but thrive. Blake and Clara Morrison had lived a beautiful life together, filled with joy and sorrow, triumph and struggle, laughter and tears. But through it all, they had each other, and that had made all the difference. Their love had warmed them through the coldest winters and sustained them through the hardest times. It had been the foundation upon which they built everything else, the constant that never wavered even as the world around them changed. And in the end, that was the greatest legacy they left behind. Not the successful ranch or the beautiful quilts or even the large family, but the example of what two people could accomplish when they chose to love each other completely, honestly, and forever. It was a lesson their descendants would carry forward into their own lives, a reminder that the most important choices we make are not about wealth or success or status, but about love, family, and the courage to do what is right even when it is hard. The story of Blake and Clara Morrison lived on, generation after generation, a timeless tale of love conquering all obstacles, of hope triumphing over despair, and of two souls who found each other against all odds and built something beautiful together. It was a story worth telling, worth remembering, and worth passing down to future generations as proof that true love, the kind that lasts forever, really does exist.